Hello guys and girls, and welcome to today's lesson. As you can see here on the screen, we are going to be continuing to talk about commas today. It's Monday, which means it is one of our days that we start with a mini grammar lesson, and so that's what we're going to be doing. And again, we're going to be talking about commas. We've spent a couple weeks already talking about commas. We started by talking about using commas with conjunctions. And then last week we talked about using commas in sentences that contain dates. And this week we're adding to that. We're actually going to be talking about two separate instances of when you will need to use commas. The first is going to be using commas to separate items in a list. And the second is going to be using commas in sentences that have adjectives. Before we jump in here and get started, make sure that you have your note-taking sheet glued into your notebook. If you have not already done that, you need to make sure you go ahead and pause the video and take care of that. You obviously need to have a pencil ready to go. And then I also wanted to add here at the beginning that all of the important stuff is going to be highlighted in yellow. So as you're working through these slides today, if you see something highlighted in yellow, it is important and it needs to be added to your note-taking sheet. Obviously, this is an Edpuzzle video. You have the ability to pause and rewind and rewatch at any point if you need to, so take advantage of that. As you are seeing those things highlighted in yellow, if you miss something, obviously guys, pause the video, go back and fill it in because we're going to be using these notes the rest of the week for our bell ringers, so they are very important. With all of that being said, I think that's all I got to get out of the way, so let's jump in here and talk about commas. Our notes today are divided into two parts. You'll see those separated on your note-taking sheet. And in this first part of our notes, we're going to be talking about using commas to separate items in a list. So when we are using commas to separate items in a list, each item needs to be separated by a comma. We're going to look at an example of that here in just a second. The final item in the list is usually preceded by the conjunction and or the conjunction or. So remember, we've talked about conjunctions. It's been a little bit. We talked about fanboys. Our conjunctions are for and nor, but, or, yet, and so. So if we see items listed out in a sentence, once we find the conjunction, most often that conjunction is and or, that final item in the list is usually preceded by that conjunction. Again, we'll look at an example just a second. The reason that we want to use commas when we have items separated in a list is because it makes our sentences much easier to read. So for example, if we had a sentence that looked like this, this gets a little jumbled and a little messy. This is a non-example. I went to the store and bought milk, eggs, bread, cheese, and butter, right? There are no commas in this sentence, but there are a list of things that we purchased from the store. So when we don't separate those items by a comma, we can look at this picture down in the corner to kind of understand why this makes this confusing. We have this woman saying, "What's a milk egg?" And the little boy is saying, "No idea. What's bread cheese?" And the reason that they're saying that is because it looks like these things are combined together. Milk, eggs, bread cheese. And that's why it makes so much more sense to separate these items in the list with a comma. So the correct example and what you should have written in your notes is the one that's highlighted down at the bottom in yellow. I went to the store and bought milk, comma, eggs, comma, bread, comma, cheese, comma, and butter. So again, when we're talking about items in a list, we're mentioning several items together. We're going to separate them all by a comma. And usually before the last item, which in this sentence is butter, we are going to see either the conjunction and or the conjunction or, just like we do here. All right, last thing I'm going to say before I move on. Number one, make sure you have everything that's highlighted in yellow copied onto your note-taking sheet. And number two, like I've mentioned all the times that we've taken grammar notes this year, please make sure when you are writing down the examples that you are copying them exactly like you see them on the screen. You want to make sure that when you copy this sentence, you include the commas, because if you don't, then you don't have accurate examples in your notes. So with that being said, if you have everything on this slide copied, we're going to go ahead and move on. If not, feel free to pause the video and get caught up. Commas can also be used to separate items in phrases. For example, my favorite hobbies are playing soccer, reading books, and listening to music. So in this particular example, we're still listing out items, but it's not just one word at a time like it was in the previous slide. Remember the previous slide, it was just all of the items that we're buying at the grocery store. But in this sentence, we have some phrases, right? Playing soccer. Those two things go together. We wouldn't put playing, comma, soccer, comma, since those two things work together. They're a phrase. Reading books is the same situation. We would not want to put a comma after reading and after books because that's a phrase that goes together. And then our last item is listening to music. So this slide is just showing you that it doesn't always have to have a comma after every single word. Sometimes there are phrases that are joined together, and we can still separate those phrases by commas rather than each individual word by a comma. Make sure that you have copied what you see highlighted in yellow. Again, pause the video if you need to. And as you're copying down the example sentence, make sure you are copying it exactly like you see it here on the screen. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and move on. All right, on this slide, we are going to take some time to do 3 practice questions. You should have these exact 3 sentences copied, or sorry, already written on your note-taking sheet. It's already printed there for you. I'm going to read through these sentences, and as I read through them, you need to place the commas where you think they belong in these 3 sentences. Number 1, my favorite foods are pizza, pasta, salad, and ice cream. My favorite foods are pizza, pasta, salad, and ice cream. Go ahead and add commas where you think they belong in number 1. And again, if you need a minute to think about it, pause the video, look back at your notes, and add those commas. Number 2, on vacation, we will be taking a train to the city, jumping from cliffs, and eating at famous restaurants. I'm going to read that one again. On vacation, we will be taking a train to the city, jumping from cliffs, and eating at famous restaurants. Add the commas where you think they belong in number 2. And finally, number 3, the band played rock, pop, and jazz music at the concert. Again, number 3, the band played rock, pop, and jazz music at the concert. Add commas where you think they belong in number 3. And before we move on, please make sure that you have at least attempted to add your commas to 1, 2, and 3. Pause the video if you need to, because on the next slide, we're going to be checking our answers. All right, here is what I was looking for with these 3 practice sentences. Number 1, my favorite foods are pizza, comma, pasta, comma, salad, comma, and ice cream. We have the conjunction and here, and so we need to separate these items in this list with a comma. Number 2, on vacation, we will be taking a train to the city, comma, jumping from cliffs, comma, and eating at famous restaurants. This is an example like we talked about just a moment ago where we are separating phrases instead of the individual words. Taking a train to the city would be our first phrase, so we need a comma there. Jumping from cliffs is our second phrase, and so we need a comma there. We have our conjunction and then we have our final phrase, eating at famous restaurants. Number 3, the band played rock, comma, pop, comma, and jazz music at the concert. Again, that's like what we did with number 1. We are separating the items in this list with a comma. And the last item in the list is jazz, and it's preceded by the conjunction and. Please, guys, double check your note-taking sheet. If you need to make any changes from the way that you added commas just a moment ago when you were practicing by yourself, please do that, but make sure that those 3 sentences have the commas in the correct places. All right, moving on to part 2, we're going to be talking about using commas with adjectives when those adjectives are describing the same noun. If you're thinking, hey, Miss Dangerfield, those words are things that I'm not super familiar with, I'm going to tell you you're in the right spot because we're about to learn what adjectives and nouns are. We're going to talk about commas used with adjectives that describe the same noun. There are 3 rules, but before we get into those 3 rules, we need to make sure that we understand what adjectives and nouns are. Let's talk about nouns first. Nouns are people, places, things, or ideas, right? Like people, Me, Miss Dangerfield, that would be a noun because it's a person, or teacher is a noun because it's a person. Place could be like LaRue County Middle School, or just a school in general because that is a place. That would be a noun. Things would be like things that you might see in a classroom, right? Like a pencil, a desk, a TV. Those are all nouns because they are things. And then ideas could be something like freedom. Freedom is a noun because it's an idea. So if we are using adjectives to describe nouns, we want to make sure that we are separating those adjectives with a comma. Adjectives are describing words. It could be things like a color. It could be things like a texture. It could be things like how many of something there are. These are all adjectives because they describe people, places, or things. They're describing words. So again, there are 3 rules that we have to consider if we are using commas with adjectives. And rule number 1 says if the adjective can be switched or rearranged without changing the meaning of the sentence, then those 2 adjectives need to be separated by a comma. So for example, she wore a soft, fluffy sweater. The noun that we're looking at in this sentence is the word sweater. And there are 2 adjectives in this sentence that describe the sweater. The sweater is soft and the sweater is fluffy. We could rearrange those words and the sentence would not change. We could say she wore a soft fluffy sweater or she wore a fluffy soft sweater. And since we can change those adjectives soft and fluffy around, we need to make sure that they are separated by a comma. So when you are copying this example on your note-taking sheet, make sure that you put that comma between soft and fluffy. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and move on. Rule number 2 of using commas in sentences that have adjectives tells us that if there are only 2 adjectives and they are joined by a conjunction, usually and or but, then they should not be separated by a comma. So for example, the car was small and red. In this sentence, we're focusing on the noun car. A car is a thing, so it's a noun. And there are 2 words in this sentence that describe the car. It is a small car and it is a red car. Since we have a conjunction and between small and red, we actually don't need a comma here. So again, to recap rule number 2, if we have 2 adjectives and they are separated by a conjunction, we do not use any commas. Last but not least, rule number 3, if you have more than 2 adjectives, so more than 2 describing words describing the same noun, then you need to separate them by a comma even if you see a conjunction. So remember rule number 2, we said 2 adjectives separated by a conjunction, no comma. Rule number 3, more than 2 adjectives, even if you see a conjunction, separate them with a comma. So for example, the car was small, fast, and red. Again, we're focusing on the car. The adjectives we're using to describe the car are small, fast, and red. Since we have 3 adjectives, even though we see this comma here, it's almost like our items in a list. We need to separate those with a comma. Please make sure that you have everything that is highlighted in yellow copied onto your notes, and then you can move on. Last part of our practice here, I want you to add commas where you think they belong in these sentences, and also tell me which one of those 3 rules that we just learned about did you have to follow to figure it out. Number 1, he was a cute brown puppy. Go ahead and add commas where you think they belong in number 1 and tell me what rule you had to follow to figure that out. Number 2, he was a cute and brown puppy. Same situation, add commas where you think they belong here. Tell me what rule you had to follow. And last but not least, number 3, he was a cute, brown, and fluffy puppy. Go ahead and add your commas and tell me what rule. And this would be a great place to remind you that you have the ability to pause the video if you need to before we move on and check our answers. Here's what I was looking for in those example sentences. Number 1, he was a cute, comma, brown puppy. That was rule number 1, which said if we had 2 adjectives describing the same noun, we need to separate them with a comma. Number 2, he was a cute and brown puppy. We actually don't need any commas there because rule number 2 told us if we have 2 adjectives describing the same noun, but they are separated by a conjunction, you don't need a comma. And rule number 3, you should have had he was a cute, comma, brown, comma, and fluffy puppy. That was rule number 3. Please make sure you have this copy down and then move on to the next part of your assignment.